Welcome back to the Liberating Yoga Podcast, a space to explore yoga as a practice and a path of healing, resistance, and deep connection. My name is Harpinder Kaur Mann. I'm a yoga educator, a writer, a seeker, here to dive into the roots of yoga, dismantle appropriation, and uplift practices that honor collective liberation while making yoga truly accessible. All of these conversations were recorded 2 years ago as a part of my research and interviews for my upcoming book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. Now I'm bringing them to you, unedited and in full, to continue the dialogue on how we can honor yoga's past while shaping its future. While mainstream American culture limits yoga to a mere fitness class or a woo-woo spiritual endeavor that belongs at home, it actually began as a philosophical commitment towards ethical action and sovereignty. In this episode, I sit down with scholar and historian of philosophy, Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. Together, we explore yoga's current definitions, how they've been shaped by Western colonization, and how we can reclaim this practice to fight racism and colonialism. Let's get into it. I'm so excited to be joined and to help myself and to help everybody. How do we pronounce your name?
So Ranganathan is my last name, Dr. Ranganathan. All the A's it's phonetic. It's just a lot of syllables. Ranganathan.
Ranganathan. Okay, beautiful. Perfect. So we'll hop right into it.
Cool.
Our first question, and the first question I've been asking everybody I'm interviewing, because I'm finding that there's just such varying definitions that people have, is what does yoga mean to you? What is the definition that you hold?
Right. Great question. So I'm a scholar and a historian of philosophy. So my approach to this kind of question is, well, what does it mean? Not what does it mean to me? Mm-hmm. And I think in the Western tradition, and this is something I write a lot about, and one of the very core commitments of this tradition is the idea that thought is language. And but our language is very idiosyncratic and personal, and so one of the very bizarre outcomes of this is that people feel the liberty to just make up definitions, and so then yoga becomes whatever you want it to be, mm-hmm. right? But if we're historical and scholarly, we'll just go back to the beginning, right? And then we can track shifts and trends in terms of people's linguistic behavior. But if you go back to the very beginning, yoga is a basic ethical theory about right action and good outcome, and it was explicitly defined as a practice of coordinating the various aspects of your life, such as your mind, body, senses, intellect, in a coordinated unit, which is the self. So when you're practicing yoga, all aspects of your life are coordinated so that you show up, you express yourself. There's nothing left over. When we don't practice yoga, we're fragmented into mind, body, senses, problems, etc. So yoga is really about the unification of ourselves as a practical, as an agent. And so you can find that in the Katha Upanishads, probably one of the earliest articulations of the philosophy of yoga. And then it continues in the Yoga Sutra. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's redescribed as Bhakti Yoga, but it's the same theory. And then, colonization happens about 1,000 years later on, with Mughal invasions and the Delhi Sultanate. And then you start to have a shift in away from the original public philosophy, which is very decolonial, to something that's kind of cowers in light of colonialism, right? So you find texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika later on talk about yoga as this thing you do in a good country where justice is administered, but in private, indoors with a human teacher. And then yoga, slowly people are starting to use the word to talk basically about asana and pranayama. So so most people today, that's kind of their way of talking about yoga. It's this thing you do in a gentrified context, indoors, not in public, with a human teacher. And it's then reduced to these physical practices. And, when we participate in the Western tradition, we think it's just all language. People say kind of nonsense things like yoga has changed or it's evolved. It hasn't changed. Just what people are using the word yoga for, that's changed, right? So if you're actually going to be historical and not, so confused as to think that changes in linguistic behavior mean changes in the thing that is being talked about, then you see that there's a history. There's a pre-colonial history to what yoga is, and then there's kind of deep confusion in a colonized world about what yoga is.
Mm. And I know for myself now, being a practitioner for over 10 years, I come across just so many people, so many students that are just like, oh, I'm not flexible for yoga. Right. Yoga to them is just an exercise. They have no idea it's a body of philosophy or a spiritual path or has anything to do with morals and ethics. Right. And we've gotten quite far from what you're talking about, that pre-colonial yoga and the way that it was practiced in every facet of life. It wasn't just something that we did for 1 hour on our mat and then we continue on with our day feeling like, I'm more flexible in my physical body. Right. Wonderful. So if we start to even kind of go back into history, what was that history of colonialism in South Asia? How did that impact yoga? And I know this is something like we could spend hours and hours, but if there's a abbreviated version.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to look at, where are the major origins of colonialism? And the global origin of colonialism, the colonialism that's gone everywhere, is a tradition that has roots in ancient Greek thought. So I call this the West. So I write this with the capital W that leans on the East. I find it kind of outrageous that we talk about the West and then we just mean white people. Or European, but Africa's in the West and the Americas in the West, and so this way of talking about the West, where it's basically white people, is colonizing. So I use I'm specific about what tradition. It's not even just white people. It's a specific tradition that goes back to ancient Greeks, and then so that as it spreads, it colonizes first. It colonizes everything around it. One of the earliest. And this becomes a tradition of white supremacy. It's a tradition of white supremacy because it treats a tradition of white people, as the judge or explanation of everything. And very early on in this tradition, the Romans, who kind of really take it to the next level, they invent this idea of religio. That's where we get our idea of religion, to talk about colonized traditions that are tolerated. And so one of the ways that this tradition of colonialism is normalized is people believe that there's such things as religions. But there are only insofar as it was made up by white people, right? So when the British come to South Asia, they use this Persian word Hindu, which basically means India, to name a South Asian religion that's indigenous and distinct from Islam. And then, now people are born. I was born thinking I was Hindu. That's what I was taught, right? Until I became a scholar and I realized that was actually invented by white people. So part of the problem, of course, is that when you start to have these, so what's so pernicious about religion is that when you have a tradition understood as religious, it's not understood in terms of what it can contribute to life. It's understood in terms of its conformity or deviation from the Western tradition, and that's treated as the secular tradition. That's just ordinary life. And then the stuff that BIPOC folks thought about that's like a side story. It's a mystical, it's spiritual. It's not about how we live our life in public with other people. And, and then once people believe this story, they no longer relate to their tradition directly. They're now colonized, and their way to this tradition is actually mediated through white supremacy. So, this is like, because there are all these levels of the trauma that ends up happening, because people then, they'll want to stand up for the tradition, and then they don't appreciate that what they're standing up for is actually largely created by the pressure of colonialism. So how old is this history? It goes back to the Romans. I think, I do talk about Mughal or Islamic colonization as kind of the first incursion of this tradition, because these folks bring with them the idea of religion, right? So, and a lot of times people have difficulty talking about that because Islamophobia is a real problem. And currently you have Hindu nationalists in charge in India who are Islamophobic, and they want to erase Muslim South Asians and Indian South Asians, and that's wrong. It's wrong on yogic grounds. They're people. You shouldn't treat people that way. But because there is this kind of nutty of Hindu nationalism, people don't want to talk about the history of Islamic colonization. And I think the reason it's important is because it brings with it the idea of religion. And the reason that's important is that's just like the oldest version of white supremacy we have in the world. So slowly from around the start of the second millennia, you have, well, first of all, you have a rupture between classical South Asia and this new thing that South Asians increasingly don't have direct access to, because what they're increasingly dealing with is their world mediated through this colonial incursion. And then when the British come, they just take over and they take it up a notch. And you can see, like, if you were to actually do the history of philosophy and thought, you can see the changes in what people, in the kind of intellectual activity people were doing. It became less about public engagement, more about escape, and in a way more Western. So, these themes are actually from Plato and Western philosophers. And as colonization starts to take over, you have a gradual Westernization of South Asia. And so unless you're lucky to inherit a pre-colonial South Asian tradition, and there are some, I was fortunate enough to inherit that, you were largely dealing with a tradition that's been altered by external influence. And there's a lot of trauma that comes with that. It's a traumatic place to start out with. So, there's a history. It's at least, if you look at the global history of white supremacy, it's a couple millennia old. If you look at the impact on South Asia, it's about a millennia old.
Mm. As you were talking, so many questions arose for me. That distinction of talking about, and I read a couple of your papers, and I can see how you have the W leaning a little bit towards the right to delineate that difference. And you're saying at that point of the Western colonizing, that also includes countries and regions like Africa and other regions. And then you also then use that to say that's an indication of white supremacy. How do those two, am I confusing that?
So just talking about the West as though we only mean white people or Europe is a kind of white supremacist discourse, because it erases BIPOC folks, right? The geography of the West includes places where you have a ton, like BIPOC people come from. So this discussion, it happens in politics all the time. You'll hear about world leaders talk about the West, and they basically mean white people countries, right? Europe, Western Europe, especially North America, right? They don't mean really Mexico or South. Like it's really just code for white people countries.
Yeah.
And the ones that are especially far from Asia, etc. And I think that's a remarkable erasure. The Europe is in the West, but so are lots of other places too. And what that way of talking does is that it doesn't allow us to appreciate the real origins of colonialism. It makes it seem like it's just a geography, right? The West. It's not. It's a specific, like, if we're thinking about the impact of this tradition, the white people tradition that politicians talk about when they talk about it, that's a very specific cultural trajectory. So, I think that's important to also appreciate the ways in which Europeans were colonized, right? Like all these pagan folks doing their own thing, not being colonizers, right? That they get swallowed in the expansion of capital W leaning on the East, Western colonialism. And so it starts early. It kind of starts first in Europe in the surrounding regions, Palestine, Northern Africa, and then it starts to spread to the Middle East. It just becomes normalized after a while, right? So by the time Islam comes about, that idea that there's secular philosophy and then there's religion, which is whatever white colonizers were taught, that's normalized. And so when Islam is born, it's born within that context of Western colonization. And then it just starts pushing further in all directions. It's just it's hard for people to think historically when they are in this colonial mindset, because they believe everything that colonization produces, and they use this as, so colonization produces the idea that there are religions. And so then people use this idea of religion to try to understand history. But that's like people using race, right? The concept of race was created by European colonizers in the modern period. Nobody really thought about race before that. All of a sudden, there were black people and white people, and then there were all sorts of attempts to try and organize these in hierarchies. And now we're saddled with these concepts, but there was a time when that would just not have made nobody would have known what you were talking about, right? But because we buy or believe these things, we have a way to read back into history things that are just made up.
Thank you, for further explaining that. So that, is it a few hundred years then between the Mughal colonization and the British coming in? Is that a history of a few hundred years?
It's hard to get exactly, but the British, no, it's more than a few hundred years. But the British colonization also kind of ramps up. It first starts off as like the East India Company. Happened like that in Canada too. There was like the Hudson Bay Company, and then they're first just doing trading, and then slowly they start ramping up. In India, they basically start buying kingdoms, right? Because it was already a feudal system. From ancient times, a feudal system, and on the ground, the leaders might not change, but who they paid upwards their tributes, that could shift and change. And so the British just kind of inserted themselves in that tradition, in that structure, and started buying up and taking over. Like they did both, various rulers, until they basically owned almost all of it. So it's it was like, what didn't happen all at once. I think it's easier to kind of think about these things in terms of the impact as opposed to the start, because the starts are often kind of vague and murky, but at some point you can see the impact that these events have had, right? And those are pretty stark. If you think historically, the before and after they're very different.
Yeah. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that before and after for those that might not know?
Yeah, sure. The before of South Asia, pre-colonially, it was what I call secularism one. It was an environment where there was no official position and people were free to adopt philosophical views that they wanted to. And the way you got along publicly was by disagreeing. You didn't think that you had to share values. You thought that you had to be able to defend your position publicly to people who disagree. And so South Asia was a tradition of rich philosophy, and philosophy was taken very seriously. And people's traditions were always connected. Whether they could fully articulate it or not that's a different story. But they were connected to these philosophical commitments. So, for instance, people don't. So, if you look at the so-called gods, the devas, right? Like the very early ones were just the forces of nature. So they weren't kind of supernatural; they were completely natural. And then you get this shift to deities that have to do with ethical theories. So Shiva is this kind of ideal experiencer, and Shakti is this range of experiences. And Shiva and Shakti get associated with teleological ethical theory. So a teleological ethical theory is concerned with the outcome. And so there's two main versions. You could be a virtue ethicist that thinks that the right thing to do comes from being a good person. And so you find a lot of Shiva and Shakti associated with virtue theory philosophy. You could also be a consequentialist who thinks that the right thing to do brings about some good outcome. And so you find a lot of Shiva Shakti. And then if you look at procedural ethical theories, where it's not about the outcomes, but the way you do things, right? Then you're in the realm of Vishnu, Lakshmi, Adisesha. And in fact, one of the things I point out is if you look at the three Kriyas at the start of book 2, there are three Kriyas that are listed as the basis of yoga as a normative practice. There's devotion to Ishvara, then there's tapas and swadhyaya. And so the devotion is Ishvara Pranidhana is devotion to sovereignty, but sovereignty Ishvara in Yoga Sutra has two essential traits. It's not stuck in its past, and it can determine its own future. And then when we're devoted to sovereignty, we have to practice that ourselves. Not being stuck in the past, determining our future. So tapas is this practice of unconservatism, and swadhyaya is this practice of self-governance. But then when you look at this and what is that supposed to do? That's supposed to get us out of being, when we practice that, we're no longer externally influenced. We're autonomous and living our own life. And, there's a very famous tableau that Hindus are used to looking at, which is this ocean of external influences. And then there's these three things floating above it. There's Adisesha, who is devoted to sovereignty, and Vishnu, tapas, he's presented with past activities as almost like the mace and the disc. And so he's not being constrained by his own past. And then Lakshmi is depicted as a lotus that sits on herself. She's self-governing, swadhyaya. And so, now when post-colonially we look in a colonized world, we look back at this and it's religion and mysticism. If we go back, they were simply communicating their philosophical commitments. And so then the stories of these very deities like the Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc., these are explorations, moral philosophical explorations about how these values fare in different contexts. So, it was philosophy all the way down. And the most important philosophical topic was Dharma, which is their word for the right or the good, which is what we call ethics. So everybody had a different view about Dharma, and they got along by disagreeing. So that's the pre-colonial. So when the British decide that there is this thing Hindu, one of the things I point out is that if we just look at what they labeled as Hindu, it's this secular history of people just having differing philosophical commitments, disagreeing. And then what happens once the label sticks is people no longer relate to the history directly. It's mediated by this idea that there's a religion. So then what ends up happening is South Asians try and confabulate, create stories about their shared religion. It's at the same time that Buddhism becomes a religion. Buddhism was just a view about Dharma, as was Jainism as a view on Dharma, right? But it's in this environment, right, that then Sikhism becomes a religion, right? It's why? Well, it's all, the Muslims are already there. They believe they have religions, right? and they believe they have a religious identity, and then that creates an environment where everybody else seems like they've got to have one too. And so people start creating all these stories about their religious identities, which would simply not have occurred had there been no Western colonization. They would have just been talking about Dharma, and they're disagreeing about it. So what we find now then in South Asia, this kind of hyper-nationalism that's tied to religious identity, is completely a creature of colonialism. Right? And, in South Asians, they don't, as people who are carrying the trauma of colonialism, they've internalized it. And then they don't know how to really deal with a world of diversity, because colonialism is anti-diversity. And so what we find now then is a continuation of the Western tradition, not actually South Asia on the whole. Right? You could of course find exceptions.
Yeah, thank you for going into that detail, because I find for my book on the chapter of colonialism, it's just been incredibly difficult, like going into the history, trying to understand what is pre-colonial yoga, how has yoga been colonized and changed. And I think that's such a valuable understanding of even knowing British comes in, labels a group of people as Hindu, that becomes a form of religion. Other religions also spring up, and being able to kind of even go before that and understand it as being different philosophies, and people are open to just debate one another and think about the morals and the ethics, and that being that yoga in action. So I think that's very valuable to have that understanding, because that answers my next question that I had is, what is pre-colonial yoga? And is there more that you want to say to that? I feel like we have
sure.
covered it.
So yoga is just one option among many, and it's the view that we find Upanishads, Yoga Sutra, Gita, and then explored in literature like the Mahabharata. The Gita is part of the Mahabharata, but even other stories. Almost all the stories of Vishnu have some kind of yoga element to them. And the essence of yoga is, well, it's a theory about the right or the good. And there are three famous ones that were also there in South Asia, but they're famous in the Western tradition. There's virtue ethics, the idea that you have to be a good person in order to know what to do. And if you're not a good person, you have to go find a good person to tell you what to do. There's consequentialism, the idea that the right thing to do brings about a good outcome. So you have to have some account of what a good outcome is. Then there's deontology, that says that there are lots of good things to do, but only some of them are the right thing to do. Karma yoga in the Gita is actually a version of deontology. Lots of things to do, but something is the right thing for you to do, and you should work on that. Yoga is a fourth account of the right of the good is unheard of in the Western tradition. And all the other ethical theories have some way of talking about the thing to do in terms of a good outcome. But yoga is the opposite of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics says you have to be a good person in order to know what to do. So the good comes first and it brings about the right. Yoga says you start with the right. And you start with the right by being devoted to the ideal of the right, Ishvara. And then you practice being that sovereign thing. And then the perfection of that practice is the good outcome. So it's a radically different way of thinking about activity, where you don't have to be good at it to do it correctly. And success is not the criterion of a successful outcome is not the criterion of whether you're actually going about the practice correctly. So there is a way to do it successfully where you might, in some ways, you might just be failing, right? But that's just what happens at the start of any practice. You start, you're bad at it. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong for you to practice it. The only way you're going to get good is by practicing. But what's so interesting about yoga is that devotional practice is meaningful itself, even if you're not very good at it. So being a yogi means that you're not going to get distracted by your own failure as you practice, right? So you'll actually be committed enough and stick it out long enough to become good at it, because you're not judging your success in terms of how great your performance is. It's about your commitment, your decision to come back to that devotional practice over and over again. So that's what yoga, it's just one option. There are lots of options, and the rest of them are not yoga. I think having this historical approach is really important, because it shows that this idea that yoga is whatever you want it to be is like sheer nonsense. And it also shows that the people who thought of yoga had a really sophisticated, clear idea of what yoga is. And so if we're not learning from that, that's our fault, not theirs.
Yeah. And what just strikes me in everything you've been saying is how far we've gotten from that. Where now we have the booty yoga and twerk yoga and goat yoga.
Yeah.
And I just gotten so far. And last time we spoke, I know I mentioned I was a part of a panel on yoga with some yoga scholars, and one of them said, I don't see a problem with modern yoga. And I just sitting there, I was like, I just can't disagree with you more. How have we gotten to this place, either through colonialism, white supremacy, this dilution, where it was this body of philosophy, a way to make an understanding of our life, to make choices, and to take ethical action and not be worried about the success of it? How do we get from that place to what we have now?
Well, certainly colonialism, but I think also it's really important to push back against this idea that yoga's changed or this modern. Yoga is the same thing it always is. It's just what you're deciding to use the word yoga for. Maybe that's changed. But then we have to take responsibility for that. Why are we using the word yoga for this instead of that? Right? What is the political purpose of taking a word that has a clear meaning in a pre-colonial context and then using it in ways that are very different? Well, I can tell you one political purpose is that it prevents us from exploring the decolonial implications of yoga. So yoga is the original decolonial philosophy. Why? Because it's about devotion to Ishvara, sovereignty. You can't be colonized if you're sovereign. And so each one of our practice of Ishvara Pranidhana, devotion to Ishvara, is a decolonial practice. And the move to modern yoga, or the move to talk about yoga as a non-philosophical practice of health and well-being, that move serves to render Western colonialism and white supremacy free from BIPOC criticism. So it's racist. It's meant to support the white supremacy of the world. It's also just remarkably ignorant, right? It's a willful ignorance, because people think that they know what yoga is because they went to a yoga studio and learned from someone who's barely educated, about yoga. The idea that somehow what we now understand as yoga is like, that's a thing, instead of just, a story told by people who are like wildly underqualified to be talking about yoga. And then yoga studies, kind of this activity within a colonized academy, then treats that as the object of inquiry without any historical. So this is the remarkable thing. It's so ahistorical. There's no historical appreciation of, well, what were the events that led to this being called yoga, right? And when I talk to, people in yoga studies, there's a reason why they're not historical, is that the religious studies and yoga studies is just kind of a subset of this, is largely a reaction to an earlier attempt to study religion as theology. And theologians are really, they're concerned about these questions about what the right answer to say what Christianity is, right? So there's actual Christianity, fake Christianity. And scholars of religion, religious studies, they wanted to move away from that because they thought that, there are lots of ways. First of all, that's kind of political when you decide, like, my form of Christianity is right and yours is wrong. But also the history just shows that there's just lots of different stories about that, right? And we can learn something about the diversity of options. So there's this trauma these folks have, this klesha that comes from their relationship with theology. And they're using that as a kind of cover for being ahistorical in the case of a colonized tradition. And what they don't appreciate is that in being ahistorical, they are actually participating in colonization. Like they don't see any, because really, this whole thing is ahistorical, right? And the moment you become ahistorical, what's colonialism, right? It doesn't even, I'm not experiencing colonialism. What does that mean, right? It just becomes all about the things that these people are observing and experiencing. So the entire, but yoga studies, if in my published work, I talk about the ancestor to this, which is Indology, is just as bad or worse, which is it's a bunch of people without training, for the most part, without any training as professional philosophers, who want to talk about the history of South Asia and write about South Asian philosophy, but without the skills you need to understand these reasons and arguments. So what they do is they try to make sense of it in terms of their outlook now. And there's just so many of them that this becomes normalized. And so, what we have in the academy is just a lot of people who know Sanskrit and nothing else. They just know, they can read the words, but my students can read English. It doesn't mean they understand the philosophy and the curriculum written in English. That's an entirely different scale. And anyways, to close my answer to this, the reason we're here is because one of the main targets of colonialism is philosophy. You can't colonize people if they're busy asking questions and engaging in debates and being critical of stories, right? The only way to get colonialism off the ground is to get people to stop asking questions and just buy it. And so what we find in yoga land, in yoga studies and Indology, is this remarkable anti-philosophy sentiment, right? Which is why these people don't think there's anything to learn, right? So they're just all so remarkably Western in that way. The Western tradition's only tradition that begins with the murder of a philosopher. And these folks are kind of continuing on that project.
Thank you. And I think what I so appreciate about your work and why I wanted to include you in the book and in this podcast is your integrity in wanting to go into the history. Because I don't think we can talk about what is yoga today and what it was before if we don't take a look at history. Otherwise, we can just say, well, things are great as they are now. Why would we want to change things? And it's like, well, we're not actually practicing yoga. No one really has an understanding of what yoga is if we don't have people like you actually saying, well, it's a body of philosophy and it's a way to move through the world and our life. And it's not just a physical practice. And I think there's just so many people that I've come across that have no interest. They have no interest in learning the history or learning the philosophy. And they're like, I'm happy just as I am. And that is enraging. But I also know there are people out there who really do want to learn and are interested. So I appreciate your work in this space.
Well, thank you. The people who don't want to learn, that's actually an expression of colonial trauma. They don't realize it, but they're scared. They're scared to learn because to learn is to to leave the bounds of this colonized experience. So they're actually willing participants in colonialism, and they're scared to escape that. And so, they're still to blame. In some ways, they're still the enemy. Like they're the problem. And in yoga has a long tradition of pointing fingers and assigning blame where it deserves. So these people are problems, and they are the enemies of like decolonization, because they're actively trying to protect colonization by not departing from what it teaches us or the propaganda it gives us. But I think the yoga this is what the yoga practice allows us to appreciate, is that is a willful ignorance. It's not an accident. It's not just that they don't know anything. It's a willful ignorance. And so then the rest of us have to pick away at that and not allow it to be normalized.
Absolutely. Do you think then yoga itself provides a path to heal and overcome these damaging colonial histories?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I only really started to appreciate what was wrong with like the ways in which colonialism is so pervasive when I really started studying the philosophy of yoga. So colonialism is an example of egotism, asmita. And egotism or asmita is the internalization of observed political regularities. When the definition in book 2 is that egotism is about confusing the perspective of a person with the power of the individual into single self. So when we engage in egotism, we tie ourselves to certain experiences as our sense of self. There's this great paper I quote often called by Grant Silva called Racism as Self-Love, and he talks about the example of a white person whose race is not because they hate black people, but because they love white people. And the example is a white person who identifies with their place in a racial hierarchy of white supremacy, and that becomes their sense of self. And then when they see a black person on the street, that alarms them because it's not consistent with their sense of how they're so much more important than that black person, right? And so the racism then is generated out of this commitment to the sense of self. The yoga response is that that's not real self-love. That's egotism. That's a fake sense of self that's developed out of the conflation of your experiences with yourself. But then when we do that, our agency is deployed to normalizing that. So if I identify, as in a male supremacist world, then my ego will only be happy when men are in charge and women are in the background. And then I'm going to get alarmed if I have to treat a woman as an equal. And then so my agency will then be deployed to normalizing my sense of self. And so I'm going to act in violent ways, in oppressive ways, say against women. This is just an example. It could be anything, right? And I think the important thing is that you don't have to be white to internalize the power structure of white supremacy as your sense of self, according to yoga. It just has to be your way of understanding yourself, right? So colonialism works then by creating an external oppressive environment where we feel like we have to accept that experience as our sense of self, because otherwise we'd have to fight against that, and that seems scary and dangerous. But then once we accept this as our sense of self, our agency is then deployed to normalizing that. So then we become agents of colonialism once we do this, right? So colonialism is then intergenerational, it's traumatic, it's about passing along this egotism. And this is all in the Yoga Sutras. So what I'm doing is just kind of extrapolating insights, in logical entailments of what's potentially wrote in the Yoga Sutra. So when we think about contemporary colonialism, right, it's simply just that, it's just an example of that process, but there's a history to this. And yoga also teaches us there's a history to all of our decisions. And when we don't live yogically, we forget about it. It's like when we leave the pot on the stove and it's on, and we leave the room, we forget that the stove is on. There's still a real consequence, but it'll haunt us in ways because we weren't responsibly dealing with our choices and our activities. So, we've all, insofar as we become these agents of colonialism, we've made decisions in the past to identify with colonial power structures because it seems too scary and dangerous to fight against. And then we internalize it, and then we become agents of that colonialism. But this is not the proper life of a person. The proper life of a person is to be autonomous, to be independent. And so when people identify with their experiences, they're actually undermining their own autonomy. So then the practice of devotion to Ishvara, right, in a religious world, in a colonized world, it sounds like mysticism. Devotion to Ishvara is about your own independence as a person and the independence of people as such. So it's already political. But, importantly, what it allows each one of us to do is to start to relate to ourselves in healthy ways. So when we have ego, we relate to ourselves in terms of these experiences we've internalized. When we start to practice yoga, we start to practice self-allyship via devotion to Ishvara. And then we can relate to ourselves without the issues, right? Without all of that baggage. And we start to find we're likable people, right? We're not those problems. And even though our past was troubled, we did pretty well, right? Especially as you start to make progress, you show yourself as a competent individual who doesn't need that baggage to make sense of themselves. And so the yoga is all about this healing. But it doesn't mean that everything's okay. Other people are still messed up, right? Insofar as they're not doing this work. And so our own practice of self-healing has to be political and push those people. Otherwise, they're going to be problems for us, right? So we have to nudge them, push them, get them to stop being agents of oppression.
What I appreciate in that is that call to awareness. That awareness, if there are ways that all of us can become agents of oppression, agents of colonialism. You don't have to be white to become an agent of colonialism.
Exactly.
And having that awareness through the practice of yoga to see ways that we may be also adding to that oppression.
Right.
And I think it's important to take this in, because I know even in the yoga space, there are folks that are okay being like the token, the representation, or at least I have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you're not actually changing anything. You're just also there now.
Right.
And I think it's important in this conversation where it's like, well, say you do get a seat at the table. Are you actually having the hard conversations, trying to change things as well? Or are you just happy that you're there now too?
Right.
So how do people do better instead of becoming also an agent of oppression?
Amazing. So absolutely. Currently, we have this nonsense tokenization in all sorts of areas of life, in business and staffing. And it is true, there is this business angle that when you allow for diversity, you do allow for new knowledge, new problem-solving skills. And so there's obvious organizational benefits to not simply having people from the same cultural background and the same. So clearly there's all that. But that doesn't mean that in rendering your participation diverse, you've gotten rid of white supremacy or colonialism, right? So for me, I think I've found that having a seat at the table is actually a concerning thing. If you actually got invited, why? Right? And I think, well, the thing we should all be doing is just doing the work all the time. And so if someone asks us to participate, we just show up as ourselves, right? So yoga simplifies life because I'm always doing the same thing. I'm always engaging in this devotional practice. So if I show up, I'm doing that too. I don't have to kind of think, oh, what am I going to say to these people now that they've invited? I'm the same guy. I'm still doing the same thing, right? But I think the alarming thing in yoga is this weird yoga land is this weird parasitic place where whatever goes on outside is then people try and kind of replicate it. So there's like trauma-informed physiotherapy, and so then people start talking about trauma-informed yoga, right? As though you needed to teach yoga about trauma. Yoga is about curing your trauma. So there's this kind of nonsense replication. And then I think in this nonsense replication in yoga land of external things going on, there's this nonsense idea that somehow simply diversifying racially or say on the basis of sex or gender or that's the magic pill. And this is why yoga is so important. Most people, given the choice, will choose colonization because it's scary to do it's frightening to become an activist, to stand up, right? So there's no reason to believe that the Black, Indigenous, people of color folks that you want to be part of this, that simply because they're Black, Indigenous, or people of color, that they haven't internalized white supremacy. In fact, if they've gotten far, they probably have as a strategy to not get in the line of fire, to not be the person that others make an example of, right? So that doesn't mean that I don't think that we should. I mean, if we're not diverse, something weird is going on, right? So there's some kind of gatekeeping mechanism that's keeping it to only so that clearly has to go. But simply thinking that because I've got a Hindu here, right? Who's going to talk about her or his tradition? That then I really know, right? That's the kind of the nonsense, right? Like, I don't know what I know just because I was raised a Hindu. I had to do a ton of research and work across multiple traditions to come to an understanding of the history of my tradition that was taken away from me by colonialism. And what we have in yoga land is this stupid idea that because someone was raised in South Asian or they know, right? And then that's just to deny the reality of colonialism, right? That's just another way to say it didn't happen. And so, there's just all sorts of levels of naivety. And if we really want to get rid of the white supremacy and colonialism, it's up to each one of us to do that work. And that means that, white folks could be far, there's no reason that a white yogi cannot be kind of more qualified to teach and transmit this knowledge than someone who's internalized white supremacy as a person of color, right? I recently did a talk about it and reminded of Malcolm X's distinction between the house Negro and the field Negro. And the house Negro identifies with the master because it's worked out well for the house Negro, right? Like, he gets to wear the clothes, he gets to eat the food, and then the field Negro is doesn't have any of that. But at any rate, I'm not the first person to kind of notice this. And I think when we are radically not racist, then we don't think there's any magic to the color of your skin, right? So being white doesn't make you racist, and being brown doesn't make you anti-racist. I think to believe that naive is a kind of weird racism, right? Oh, they're white, they're clearly racist. Oh, that person's dark, they're clearly not. It's pure nonsense.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe going to the extreme other end where we're just we got to fix this really quickly. So how can we fix it quickly? Let's just bring in someone that looks brown or Black. And now we've done the work. And it's well, we haven't done the work. The work actually takes sitting down with self-inquiry and having conversations, and how this is so ingrained into each one of us, into society, into all the systems that we exist in. And I find in the world that we live in, no one feels like they have time to do that work. We just got to find a quick sort of Band-Aid and let's move it forward. I think it takes that time and the effort in actually becoming decolonial and decolonized.
Right. Well, that's because the effort is our own. It's not, we have to fix ourselves. Otherwise, we are agents of oppression, right? And so to think about, oh, the solution will be I'll have a brown person next to it, is to not do the work, is to not really appreciate. I mean, even to think that tokenizing effort is a solution is to have already failed to appreciate how this works. This works because we buy the power structures, right? And unless each one of us is, unless as individuals we're not bucking that and doing something else, we just reproduce it. So, but also I think this is part fashion. It's fashionable a bit right now to do this kind of thing, and so people are responding to that. And South Asians have decided, and I get it. Like when I got into yoga land, it's not like I hadn't experienced racism, but people would tell me things like, yeah, we go to these yoga conferences and it's just all white people standing up and they have no clue what they're talking about. My South Asian friends would tell me. And like, this is nonsense. And then I started going to some of these things and it's true. Like people will just get up, white folks get up, start talking, and they have no clue. They're just basically rebranding whatever feels good to them as yoga. And then I could kind of see why my South Asian friends were like, you would think that they should give some room for us, because if everybody's just going to talk whatever comes to mind, at least this is our tradition, and so there's some chance of us actually saying something accurate. And so I am sympathetic. I think that's true when the choice is between just kind of people talking out of their butt, right? If that's what, then you should have some South Asians around, because at least if they do that, it's more likely to have something to do with yoga than not.
Yeah,
but that's still more likely not, to actually know is a lot of work. And I think for those of us South Asians who are in this, we have to have enough respect for the history to want to do the learning. And that's not an overnight thing. I entered university when I was 19. I just turned 50. And I'm still learning, but that entire time was my research, right? Every year I was learning more.
Yeah. And thank you for, that reminder where this work and the learning will take years and years. And it's not something that's going to just happen. Like I snap my fingers and all of a sudden now I know. Right. And I think that also, just adds a lot of grace too, where it's like, you don't need to all of a sudden know. It's okay to take that time. It's okay to not rush these things.
Great.
Because there's a lot that gets like unpacked and unraveled in that work. And that kind of adds now to my next question of, so how can people begin this work of understanding this complex history? How do they begin decolonizing themselves, their understanding of yoga, their practice, their study?
Yeah. So what I was going to say to the previous observation, which is kind of the segue to what I would say to this, is that kind of gentleness with ourselves, to not have all the answers all of a sudden, is really an important part of devotion to Ishvara, because as we are devoted to sovereignty, it's a practice. It's not about the outcome. And so part of that practice is coming to terms with your ignorance, the ways in which you made assumptions, but you really didn't have any reason to make those assumptions. And also that you need answers, but that's going to be a result of the practice. So you can't speed that up. You can maybe just speed up your practice by being more serious about it. So that's the number one thing people need to do to decolonize themselves and open themselves up to learning. In the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali says that Ishvara is the first teacher. And I think that's because in order for us to learning is always about increasing our own independence from ignorance. And we only ever learn when we've done the work ourselves. People can lecture us, they can try and give us propaganda. That's not learning. Actual learning is when we've done the work ourselves, and then we know because it's something we can do. So taking this devotional practice seriously is the first step. It's helpful to find someone who's been doing this work for a long time. And I'm sad to say that I can't really point to anybody else, because this work isn't work that gets passed down from teacher to student in settings of colonialism. So you have to have a really weird learning trajectory, right? So I don't have a yoga teacher. I don't have a Swami or guru. Like, I look at these people and I'm never impressed. Like, how do they know? So for me, right, it was really, I did everything from scratch, the ground up. But, you don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. You can find stuff that I've written, but none of this is going to make any difference if you're not actually doing the work. So I'm, always happy. I'm doing this to share the result of my research. That's why I've started yoga philosophy. That's why I teach. But, the value in what I have to share won't be anything appreciable if you're not actually doing the work yourself. And if you're not doing that work yourself, you'll never learn anything, right? So I think it just comes down to our own commitment to this devotional practice.
And I know for my own practice and study, knowing that it does take a while to find teachers and people who want to study and teach yoga in this way. So if someone is wanting to understand these complex histories, I would definitely recommend you as a resource. And I know you sent me a bunch of things that I was able to read and look over. Although at times I was like, some of these are big words.
You can do it.
And I was like, okay, let me put my little scholarly hat on, and trying to understand this. But I know I've definitely learned a lot from you, and I'm excited for people to also be able to turn to you as a resource in doing this work. A question that also came up to me, and this is from much earlier before that I didn't get to touch on, is why do you think yoga has now been reduced down to asana? Why is it the way it is now?
Yeah, so this is not a new thing, right? So I think so you can already see this in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is around 1400 CE. So recently I draw a distinction between capital Y yoga and small y yoga. So capital Y yoga is the full devotional practice, which is just how you live your life. And then small y yoga are ways in which you can implement that. So, asana could be a small y yoga way for you to practice tapas and svadhyaya, unconservatism, self-governance, as you're devoted to sovereignty. So could breathing exercise. So all these things could be ways to practice yoga. What happens then in time is that there's a kind of severance between the philosophy and the small y yoga things. And then people talk about the small y yoga things as though they're simply yoga on their own. And that severance is colonialism, because the big Y yoga is decolonial. So what colonialism does is it discourages that kind of courageous devotion to Ishvara, and it encourages hiding. And that's exactly, if you were to read that, I'm amazed. People would quote this Hatha Yoga Pradipika. I'm like, what's this? I'm a historian of philosophy. It's not really a very famous philosophical text, but if you look at, say, yoga lines, it's on the list of things that they think students of yoga are supposed to know. It was influential later on. And I remember reading it for the first time, and I was just shocked, because I think what I knew about yoga was this historical thing. You go out and you live your life publicly, and if other people are against you, you have to fight them. You can't let them we're always making choices, and we can't allow others to dominate us. That's irresponsible, right? So each one of us has to stand up for ourselves, and in doing that, we stand up for individuals and people to live the kind of non-oppressed lives. And here you have this text that talks about going to a nice place, finding a human teacher, and doing something in secret. Because if you talk about it out in public, it'll lose its power. And so now yoga is a spiritual practice, something you do in a yoga studio with the yoga teacher in a gentrified neighborhood. That's the Hatha Yoga Pradipika right there. So it's not an overnight thing. It's been going on for centuries. I think about teachers like Krishnamacharya, who's a Sri Vaishnava. I'm a Sri Vaishnava too, and I never appreciated Sri Vaishnava by birth. I never appreciated how lucky I was, because the Sri Vaishnava tradition is a pre-colonial South Asian tradition, and it's a tradition based on yoga. So there's a kind of, if you could get rid of all the colonization, there's actually a lot there kind of directly teaching us about yoga philosophy. So when I think about Krishnamacharya, right, he is the father of modern yoga. He taught a lot of the very famous yoga teachers, but he wouldn't have thought that yoga was just asana, right? That wouldn't have been him, but he would have thought, oh, well, I'll get you started on, because you're a kid or you're just starting out, I'll get you started on this, and we could talk about other things too. And then what people did, even though they had an opportunity to learn about, they just took the stuff they wanted, which was the asana, right? Because this colonial mindset had already set in. So even though there would have been kind of new opportunities to learn, and I'm not saying that Krishnamacharya was somehow a genius about all these things, but there was at least an avenue to learn about yoga, big Y yoga. People chose the small Y yoga for these colonial reasons. And it's easier to market. It's harder to sell independence. It's easier to sell a technique of wellness that people want because they think it's going to make their life better. You can charge, like, it's just amazing. Like, people will pay a ton of money if you tell them, I will teach you something that will get you what you want. And they'll pay thousands of dollars, maybe millions, but teaching people the philosophy so that they end up creating their own success. Oh, well, it's almost like any money's too expensive for that. That's the kind of the remarkable thing. Like, what would really be helpful to you? Oh, too expensive. I can't afford that. But this is part of the sickness of the colonial mindset. Always looking for, instead of dealing with ourselves as people who need to be independent, we're always looking for some way out of a problem. And it's never about us. It's never about ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point on returning to oneself, and kind of leads back to the conversation we've been having around that self-inquiry instead of looking for some sort of quick fix. Right. I feel like a lot of us in the yoga industry space probably have enough techniques to last lifetimes. But are we spending the time to learn about the history and the philosophy? I think that's what's missing. And this then leads into one of my last questions is, what changes and hopes do you wish to see in yoga land and the yoga industry, or in this space in general?
Yeah, I try not to have such wishes and hopes. It's not really part of my practice. I think about myself as kind of showing up and doing what I can in terms of my practice, and that shifts and changes. When you think about the practice personally, it's something you have to manage in your life. And so, I think one of the things that I've learned is that when you really do show up and you really are practicing and you're sharing this, there are ways to make connections with others, because this is a very personal thing. And insofar as it's personal, it's something we could share with other people. And so, these connections of solidarity with other people who realize that this work is their work is really powerful, because it's really going to be that changes things. It's going to take enough people who are doing the work to increasingly shine a light on how this kind of monetized self-help industry really is a deviation. And I think people are going to have to be creative about how they actually properly monetize this, right? It's just no part of this is martyrdom. So all of us who are actually serious about sharing this have to learn how to make a living while actually sharing the real thing. And that's harder. It's easier to make money off of snake oil, right? It's easier, like telling people to eat well and exercise. People don't want to do that, right? It's easier to like sell them weird potions and things that they think that they can drink is going to fix everything. So yoga's a bit like that. They're like, eat well, exercise, get good sleep. Like, whoa, so hold on here, right? We're going to have to learn how to be successful sharing that kind of knowledge with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in spaces I've been in, and students I've taught, where they're like, oh, I heard about this specific technique. Can you teach it to me? Is this going to fix my core or whatever is going on? I was like, well, let's back up and let's talk about some other things. Like, no, I want to learn that. And I'm just like, okay, where did you hear this? YouTube. And I'm like, okay. And it's just really interesting being in this space. And one of my teachers talks about yoga teachers become like service providers.
Right.
So whatever the student is wanting, the student being the customer, they're right. So if they want something, let me get that for you. Let me modify it for you. And I think for us in this work is, how do we stay in integrity to our practice and to what's true to us, instead of just conforming as soon as we see a change or a student wants something in particular, where it's just like, well, let me go back to my values and let me go back to my practice.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, this is the conflict in the yoga land, is that yoga is dressed up as an educational product, but the way people make money is out of fulfilling customer expectations. You can't teach the student. This is just the real. If someone's a student, they don't know. They don't know what's actually of value. That's why there's a student, right? But because the industry makes money off of the customer being, there's a deep conflict. And I think the flip side of it is also that most people involved lack knowledge because they've lacked a seriousness for learning. So they're actually not really in a position to teach either. And so the real trick is, once again, right, that we ourselves have to be learning. We ourselves have to be practicing, and then sharing that as the product that we can sell as education. And, it's not like teachers can't make money, but it does seem easier not to do it, right? I think that's just it. It's just easier. So at least for the moment, I think that if people are seriously courageous, the one thing that I've seen is that it makes you distinctive, right? Because you're actually doing the practice while everybody else is selling tricks or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I can definitely see that. But I have also found in doing this self-inquiry work, how much it's had me pause and stop and change the way that I teach and the way that I do things. And I think doing this work is going to require that, where you just realize, oh, maybe that thing I was doing isn't the right way to do it anymore.
Yeah,
and knowing that that's a part of it and that's okay.
Right.
And being okay with that change.
Yeah. Don't try and be like others in this world. This is just like one of the things very early on. I'm like, don't even try. It won't work out well for you if you actually care about the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know I have learned so much and put so many pieces together. And I know everyone that's going to listen to this or read it in the book is going to gain so much from it as well. Where can people find more of what you have to say and teach if they're looking to connect?
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for these great questions and the wonderful conversation. So my website, yogaphilosophy.com. You could start there and you can sign up for my email list. I'm also on Instagram, yogaphilosophy_com. I do a lot of philosophy there. So those are kind of the ways that you can start to engage with my products. I have a lot of free courses. You can find those also at yogaphilosophy.com. So those are places to start.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in. I'll catch you for the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for being a part of this journey. If today's episode resonated with you, please share it with your community and let's keep this conversation going. You can connect with me on Instagram at Harpinder Yoga and dive deeper with my book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. Until next time, keep practicing with intention and integrity. This is Liberating Yoga, where we honor yoga's past and shape its future. Bye, y'all. Until next time.